Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 352. In this episode, we're continuing our journey through the fall of Númenor by exploring the rise of the Númenorean Empire. Before we get started, I'd like to give a double up air five to our amazing fellowship. 3, 2, 1. Whoopsh. Threw you off a little there, didn't I? Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., Melkor27, and KG. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in September or October of 2023. Catherine, Tom S., Cherie R., Stephanie B., John W., Alan C., Dustin Q., Robert S., Melkor27, Eugene D., James L., Ken P., Samuel B., Redhawk, Alex S. Thank you all so much for sticking with us over the years. Join the Fellowship of the Road by visiting patreon.com/TolkienRoad. When you join the Fellowship of the Road, it helps us to keep on evering on and land you some cool perks along the way. Learn more at patreon.com/TolkienRoad. If you're watching, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. Finally, attention binge listeners, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. If you are a 5-star fan of the Tolkien Road, you can really help us out by heading over to iTunes or your preferred source for the show and dropping us a rating and review. When you do that, it helps get the word out about the Tolkien Road, which helps us to keep on evering on. All right. The War of the Three Rings is over. With Sauron's armies destroyed, Middle-earth is at peace. However, Middle-earth's peace brings with it a new threat, Númenorean Empire. In this episode, we'll consider the events spanning the years of Second Age 1731 through Second Age 2029, as Númenor spreads its influence over Middle-earth, and the Shadow spreads its influence over Númenor. The original sources for this portion are primarily Unfinished Tales, Lord of the Rings appendices, and Akalabaith. All right. So we begin this episode by looking at the figure of Tar-Minestir. Now, Tar-Minestir is familiar to us from the past several episodes, past few chapters. There was essentially, there's some confusion in the way that Tolkien wrote this about when exactly Tar-Minestir became king. Really, Tar-Ciryatan seems to have been the ruling queen until this year, 1731, but there are other sources that speak of Tar-Minestir as if he is the ruling king before this. I won't get too much into those details, but we'll assume the date of 1731 as the date of Tar-Minestir's ascension. But before we leave Tar-Ciryatan behind, I want to mention what's really significant about her death and the transition of power to Tar-Minestir. So, before Tar-Ciryatan, it was normal for rulers of Númenor to resign while they were still of sound mind. And I actually did the math on this. The average lifespan after they resigned before Tar-Ciryatan was 21 years. 21 years of post-reign lifespan. The only exception to that is Elros, the very first king of Númenor, and it was, of course, after his death, but it became a normal thing. Not because he was a bad ruler, but just, the idea there was that, really kings and, queens shouldn't be hanging on to power, right up until the very bitter end. There should be a smooth transition of power so there's no, funny business that happens. So there's, and really it's almost like a spiritual thing. I've talked about this in another episode that, that the point of being the ruler is not so you can have power. The point of being, for its own sake. The point of being the ruler is to have power for the sake of the common good, right? To rule for the, for the happiness, for the flourishing, for the good of those that you rule. And that was, Númenor really tried to emphasize this point with its rulers. And so they had this custom of resigning. There wasn't like a set time that they had to resign, but, of resigning while they were still of sound mind. They would rule until they were pretty old, but, still of sound mind. We all, if you've experienced, the death of a grandparent or loved one, that is fairly old, you probably know there's kind of a time where they're pretty old, but they're still of sound mind. And then, within a few years, it can be even more rapid than that. There can be a real decline in just like their cognitive abilities. And so, that's the idea here, is that, Númenor should, the ruler of Númenor should resign, with plenty of time to transition power to the next generation, and there not be any concern about, the state of mind of the current ruler. So, but Tar-Ciryatan hangs on to power until almost the very end. And she's also the longest lived, with the exception of Elros. Something has changed in the Númenorian monarchy. So she lives to be 411 years old, which is the longest of any of the rulers, except for Elros, who lived to be 500 years old, was really the exception, the great exception. But Tar-Ciryatan does in fact live longer, and she does not resign the scepter until the same year that she actually dies. So it's probably one of these cases where she should have resigned much sooner. So, it's interesting. Maybe she had kind of a deal with Tar-Minestir. The text doesn't really make a huge point about this, so it's possible, because of things that are said elsewhere, that like there was some kind of arrangement, because of course Tar-Minestir was not the child of Tar-Ciryatan. Tar-Ciryatan did not have any children, so it's possible that Minestir was kind of like the not the official ruler, but the ruler in actuality, if you will, like the one who actually exercised power, while Tar-Ciryatan kind of hung on to power officially, right? So maybe there was some kind of an arrangement there, but we don't get any specifics about that, so we don't exactly know for sure. Minestir reigns from 1731 to 1869. He is 257 when he ascends and 395 when he dies. His reign spans 138 years. His name means watchtower, and we talked some about Tar-Minestir in the last few episodes, so I'd encourage you to go back and review those if you have more interest in him. But it is during his reign that the first sign of the shadow appears in Númenor. So we jump ahead 69 years to the year Second Age 1800, and we learn that Númenor establishes dominions on the coast. It says they had tasted power in Middle-earth. So, of course, Second Age 1800, this is 100 years after the end of the War of the Three Rings, as I term it, where Númenor had really come to the rescue, had really saved Eriador, had saved the elves of Western Middle-earth, really all of the free peoples of Western Middle-earth, and had completely destroyed the armies of Sauron and sent Sauron fleeing back to Mordor, really with his tail between his legs. And this is 100 years later, and there has been really no further sign of Sauron in the West. And but instead of Númenor really, kind of going back to the status quo, what do? Well, they create permanent settlements on the western coast. This was not something they had done before. Anytime before they had created, they had done any kind of like creating of settlements, they hadn't been permanent settlements. It actually makes that point in the story of Aldarion and Erindis when it talks about some of Aldarion's journeys to Middle Earth. And one consequence of this is they became too powerful for Sauron to attempt to move west out of Mordor. So Sauron had he knows at this point that there was no he didn't have any chance at this point against the forces of Númenor, and maybe that's why. Maybe that's part of the reason they justified making these permanent settlements, is like, well, if we're here, then Sauron's not going to try any of that funny business again. It all of this, I will say, very much reminds me of what happened at the end of World War II when the U.S., of course, wound up having a lot of forces in Europe. And they and the same in Japan and in the Pacific, and they kind of really created this American empire that had influence not just in the actual United States of America, but really all over the globe. And on one hand, you might say, well, there's a reason for that, right? There's a reason for that in Europe. And really in the Far East as well, there was concerns over the rise of totalitarian regimes, and they couldn't really give these war-torn areas a chance to fall under the influence of those people. So it's like, well, we'll just keep some forces in these different areas, and that will deter the possibility of, these totalitarian regimes having influence over these different parts of the world. So one might say that Númenor was somewhat justified in this, but when we learn more about how they carried this out, we're going to realize that, even if they used that as an excuse, that wasn't the reality of it. So we do learn how, even though Sauron doesn't attempt anything in the west again for a long time, we do learn that he extends his power eastwards. So let's look at our trusty map again, just to kind of get the lay of the land here at in the year Second Age 1800. So you'll recall from past episodes that Sauron had basically attempted to take over Eriador in this method. Númenor comes to the rescue, and Sauron's forces are destroyed, and Sauron is really driven all the way back to Mordor. So that's where things ended with the War of the Three Rings. And so at this point, the Númenorians have established their own strongholds, in places like these. Okay, and actually, we'll go up a little further up the river right there. But anyway, they've established strongholds in various places. We don't get a ton of detail about where they were, but we know from later on in the history of Númenor and then of Gondor, of like where certain certain settlements may have been. But over the course of this time, Sauron is really exerting his influence to the east. And we might think like, he's kind of coming up into this area over here. And we get actually a good bit of detail about this later in the Lord of the Rings about, the people that live in these like outer regions of Mordor here. And, and we might imagine that maybe some of this influence extends into the south as well, where maybe Númenor isn't as concerned about what's going on. So, was it a folly of Númenor and the elves to not utterly destroy him at the end of the War of the Three Rings? Again, hindsight is 20/20. There doesn't really seem to have been a lot of that sort of discussion, and it does make you wonder why. I mean, he really tried to destroy them. If somebody, you'd at least think they'd want to apprehend him and place him under arrest while he's at his weakest, assuming that he'll probably try it again. But unfortunately, this kind of seems to be a recurring folly amongst the people of Middle-earth. And I will say, like, I think that's a folly in general of those who tend to be more benevolent types of people and groups. They assume that, that maybe these people, maybe these, malevolent types have learned their lesson. And, maybe that underestimates, the psychopathic, sociopathic factor a good bit. That, at the end of the day, there's some types that just won't be reformed. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to, utterly kill them, perhaps, but it means that maybe you can't just let them kind of go home and be like, okay, you're under house arrest, like, or, just be like, okay, you can have your area back there. Just don't bother us anymore. He tried it once. Why wouldn't he try it again? So, it's odd to me that they didn't at least, especially with Númenor having so much power, that they would not have gone after him. But, I mean, there was a lot to that kind of expedition in the ancient world. They had all of their forces up here. They would have had to cross the Misty Mountains. Maybe at one point they thought, well, maybe we can bring our forces down to the mouth of the Anduin and attempt a landing down here, and then we'll be much closer to Mordor. But they didn't know also, like, maybe Sauron has a bunch of forces. Maybe Mordor itself is fortified, and so there would be a big battle necessary to root him out of there. We might think of the end of World War II with the Japanese forces being really pushed all the way back to the islands of Japan, to the main islands of Japan, and the prospect of having to invade, right? That, goodness, how many would have died if there was actually an invasion of Japan on both sides, right? On both sides, the number would surely have been in the millions. Just maybe the most horrible series of battles in the history of mankind, if they had actually happened. So that might have been part of the calculus here of not really pursuing Sauron and trying to apprehend him back in Mordor. So, but nevertheless, hindsight's 2020. They're going to look silly because of what happens in the future, but it is what it is. The other thing that Second Age 1800 calls out is that the shadow falls on Númenor. It says they began to yearn for the west and the forbidden waters, meaning the waters near the Blessed Realm. The more joyful was their life, the more they began to long for the immortality of the Eldar. This is part of the shadow falling upon them, that they're not content with the idea of living for a long time, even longer than most, men could ever dream of living, that the longer their life was, the more they wanted to live. And that's where I see this significance with the reign of Tar-Ciryatan being right up until really, the same year that she died. She was not willing to give up life. She wanted to hold on to it. And this was a change in the way Númenor operated. And you might say, as the ruler goes, so goes the nation. And we start to see this trend get closer and closer to this trend, concern over the having of power rather than how to wield it wisely. And nowhere maybe is that better exemplified than in the examples of Tar-Ciryatan and his son, Tar-Atanamir. Now, Tar-Ciryatan, let's talk a little bit about him. He becomes the ruling king of Númenor in the year 1869 of the Second Age. Now, Tar-Ciryatan was actually the admiral that led the forces of Númenor, the fleets of Númenor, in the War of the Three Rings and their victorious landings at the Grey Havens and then at the mouth of the Gwathlo. That really put an end to the forces of Sauron and Eriador. So, he's a pretty great warrior. He takes power at the age of 235 and reigns for 160 years. But he scorns the yearnings of his father. Now, you might remember Tar-Ministir. He had built this watchtower near Andunier in the west. Over here. Turn on my thing here. All right, there we go. So he builds this Tower of Oramet, and it really looks out towards the west, towards the Blessed Realm. So, Tar-Ciryatan, before he's king, he scorns, right? He scorns his father's yearnings for the uttermost west. And really what it seems to be is that Tar-Ciryatan, being this great warrior, is perhaps of a mind to seize, right? Like, why should we yearn for it when we can seize it? We have the power to do so. Now, this is foolish thinking, of course. You're talking about going up against immortals and gods, right? As mere men, as mere mortals. But he might think to himself, well, we beat one god, right? We beat, we had to come to the aid of the elves of Middle Earth, and we beat this, powerful lowercase g god Sauron. So why couldn't we do the same thing in the uttermost west? So, maybe this is where, a root of scorning his father's yearnings for the west. Very significantly, he forces his father to yield the scepter before his father wills to do so. And it actually says this is the coming of the shadow upon the bliss of Númenor, this like wrangling over power. We may see that it started to sort of manifest, or the possibility of it started to manifest with the, with the refusal to yield until the very last year of Tar-Ciryatan. But in this handoff, it's the son forcing the hand of his father, right? This is the coming of the shadow upon the bliss of Númenor. Ciryatan also plunders the wealth and oppresses the men of Middle Earth, so it's not really about simply keeping a watch on the shores of Númenor in case Sauron returns. This is more about plundering the wealth of Middle Earth and bringing and oppressing its people. So this is when Númenor really starts to fail, and what I argue is its original mission, right? Its original mission was to bring the light of the blessed realm, right? I would even say to bring the knowledge of Iluvatar and of man's close relationship with Iluvatar, the creator god, back to the men of Middle Earth, who for so many generations had lived under the shadow, to teach them wiser ways of living, so that they might live happier lives upon this earth. But now they start to really exploit these people, right? They start to exploit these people, and so they have they have failed in their mission. They've turned it on its head, and they have started to become a force of evil rather than of good in Middle Earth. Before they had come to help men afflicted by Sauron, but now they were their oppressors. So what was the mind of Tar-Ciryatan? Take it by force. I really think that's the mind. We see that really helped him as a warrior, but when it comes to ruling, not so much. He was not a man of peace, I would say, by any means. And so he and his son Tar-Atanamir, who we're really going to focus on in the next episode, it says they were proud, eager for wealth, laying the men of Middle Earth under tribute, and taking rather than giving. And that reminds me, there's this saying at this camp my sons went to a few years ago, and it's a really great little saying. It's boys take, men give. Boys take, men give. And that's a great little mantra for a young man to have, and to understand the difference between being a boy and being a man. But it's also, I think really encapsulates the difference between the early rulers of Númenor versus the later rulers of Númenor. And we're going to start seeing a lot more of the taking with the later rulers of Númenor than the giving. All right, let's also briefly consider the pencil sketch in this section. So pull it up here. All right, so our image here, I think it's a pretty cool image. I think what we have here is an image of a Númenorian fortress upon the shores of Middle Earth. You can see the ships down here in the water, and then you see these fortresses up here. Pretty intimidating looking places. So that's what we're dealing with in our pencil sketch in this chapter. All right, so what are the key takeaways for this chapter? Well, first off, Númenor becomes imperial here. I mean, really, there's no way around it. They've gone from being, just this island nation who maybe shows up from time to time to help, to being a, this kind of haughty nation that extends its rule over other peoples, right? They're not just there to help, they're there to rule, to dominate, and they have become imperial. Also, Sauron rebuilds in the east. He's far away from where anybody can give him, kind of watch over what he's doing, anybody that would at least care or that could, be a challenge to him. And so he's able to dominate to the east and over time rebuild his forces so that he can take on the Western powers, Númenor and the elves of the West, again in the future. And then Númenor has come under the sway of the shadow. Not Sauron, right? Not Sauron, but the spirit of Morgoth, which Sauron wields for his purposes. Remember, Morgoth was the original spirit of domination, right? He wanted to dominate he wanted to dominate all of the world. He really viewed himself as the ruler of Arda, right? And so he wanted to dominate the whole world. And that spirit of domination, I think, is really what comes over Númenor. We might also argue just this idea of, for men, I think the shadow is also the shadow of death, and not knowing how to look beyond the shadow, right? That death is actually in accord with their nature, but it's not necessarily the end. And they begin to lose this ability to trust in the will of Iluvatar for something beyond death, for something beyond death, and they start to place all their hope in the world. This world, man, for Númenorians, this world must have seemed like a pretty great place, relatively speaking, right? But they start to, to forget about, their connection with Iluvatar, and they start to place all their hope in this world, and that leads to the building up of wealth, to the dominating of other people, so that they can have their way in the world and everything they want it to be for this short time they're here. So, well, that is about it for this episode. Next time we'll look at the highly significant reign of Tar-Ciryatan and the beginning of Númenor's decline. So, quick reference to a user comment, a little correspondence time. This is from Ken Page 3321 on October 22nd on YouTube in response to episode 350, The Battle of the Grey Havens. Ken says, I liked the mentions of Eregion during the last 2 episodes, but am frustrated we hear so little about a place that is potentially as significant as Gondolin in the Lord of the Rings mythos. I wonder why Tolkien doesn't take the opportunity for the Fellowship to pass the ruins of Eregion when they pass south from Rivendell to the pass at Moria. Does anyone know what state Eregion is in by the end of the Fourth Age, or where else we can find descriptions of how it was before the fall? So I'm not sure if you mean by the end of the Third Age. I certainly don't think we have any idea of the end of the Fourth Age. I guess it's possible it's mentioned in some of the short writings we have on that, but I would just in general agree with your comment, Ken. I mean, it's frustrating that we don't get more especially after we read about it and its importance in this time period, and maybe even like get this hint of its glory before the War of the Three Rings. And I went back and I actually looked at the Lord of the Rings, the parts where they're near Eregion, Hallin, and it talks about how there is even though it's essentially a ruin, and that's probably why he doesn't say a lot of it. It's just really a ruin, and by the time Lord of the Rings happens, it's been, it's been almost 4,500 years since the destruction of Eregion. So, I mean, it is ancient history by that point. We can lose sight of that, I think, because, we just jump forward from, this period to this period. And also, we think about some of these elves that lived, that knew of Eregion, Elrond and Galadriel, who are both characters in Lord of the Rings. And certainly Elrond shares some of his reminiscences, at one point or another. And what they say is just that even at that time in the ruins, it was still kind of a, it was still a place they felt relatively safe, even in the wilderness. The Fellowship did, because, the memory of the elves that had once lived there really still lingered there, and that didn't disappear very easily. But that's more of just, I think, kind of the woo-woo sense that Gandalf gives about it. It doesn't really speak to anything in terms of seeing any of the ruins or anything like that. I mean, it's extremely ancient by then. It's possible it's just completely overgrown, I suppose. But I do think there are hints that they maybe see some, like hard to recognize remnants of it. So unfortunately, I mean, I agree with you. I just wish we had more stories from the Second Age and all of the ages of Middle Earth, really. I think it's unfortunate that Tolkien, never got around to telling us those other stories. But that it is what it is. So no, I don't think there's really more descriptions available of Eregion out there, other than really what we see in the Fall of Númenor and kind of the general much 4,500 year later sense in Lord of the Rings. But if anybody knows of any, please feel free to mention them in the comments. So good comment, Ken. Appreciate you. As always, keep the correspondence coming. We'll do our best to respond to you somehow and at some point. Don't forget to stop by TrueMythsPress.com for great merch like super styling and comfy Tolkien Road t-shirts, 2 Trees camper mugs, and signed copies of my books. Once again, that's TrueMythsPress.com. Thanks for supporting our work with your purchase. And a thank you to our amazing patrons, especially the following: John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., Melkor27, KG, Emilio P., Jonathan D., Robert H., Paul D., Julia, Werty, JoeBagelMan, Richard K, Matt R, Matthew W, John W, Eugene D, Chris B, Daniel S, Seb M, Cory C, Carolyn S, Emiel K, Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T, Redhawk, Shannon S, Brian O, Zeke F, James L, Chris L, Asya V, Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C, David of Pints with Jack, Eric B, and Alaskan Moose 31. Thank you all so much for your support. We truly appreciate our fellowship. And thanks to everybody for watching and or listening. We will talk at you next time. Bye-bye.